Today, the Senate's holding its first oversight hearing of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, first time since 2019. Director Carvajal, thanks for joining us. To start today's hearing, I'd like to show a short video that offers a look behind bars for the more than 152,000 people in our nation's federal prison system. In 1993, at the age of 23, Alton Mills received a mandatory life sentence with no parole for a nonviolent drug offense.
One was having to ask themselves, why did they give a young man, the age of 23 years old, a life sentence?
On a per capita basis, the United States has more people behind bars, 2.3 million, than any other country in the world.
Some of the biggest COVID-19 outbreaks in the U.S. are in the prisons and jails that house more than 2 million people.
They literally leaving us in here to die.
It's just looking grim. It's only a matter of time before we all get it. We just in here, look.
Andrea Hyber died tragically in BOP custody after delivering her baby while on a ventilator.
They hadn't called me at all to even let me know she was sick or that they were sending her to the hospital. Or I haven't heard from them at all.
Knowing that this virus is out there, it's hard to imagine the layers of, frankly, ignorance and neglect that would have to take place for that to happen. And then just the lack of concern for humanity.
I wasn't there to see them graduated from high school, see my grandkids.
They're failing to protect the people who are in their custody, that they have a constitutional obligation to protect. They are failing to protect their staff and the people who work there.
When she was crying out for help, I know they had failed her.
You got to be a change. Because there's other people like me on the inside. They got families, got children. They need to be home.
I might just add that I know Alton Mills, gentleman who was just on the video here, sentenced to life in prison at age 23 for a nonviolent drug offense. He was released because of the work of this committee and changes in the law that have taken place. I thank Senator Grassley for joining me in that effort. Senator Cornyn was part of it as well, and was signed into law by President Trump. Alton Mills has a job. He's worked ever since he's got out of prison. He's reunited with his family. He is no threat to society. He is making a positive contribution. For years, I've sought to address the injustices and challenges that impact the lives of incarcerated families, along with the staff who are responsible, the men and women who go into these federal prisons and work there. Their health and well-being is our concern, certainly as much as, if not more, than the inmates. Now, I've worked across the aisle, as I mentioned, with Senator Grassley to pass bipartisan legislation like the Fair Sentencing Act and the First Step Act to reform federal sentencing laws and help inmates successfully return. I've held hearings on the conditions of confinement. I think some of the most memorable hearings of my life were in this room with those who had been held in virtual solitary confinement, some for as long as a decade. And I've dealt with the issue of treating incarcerated individuals with mental illness. I think over and over again of the sheriff of Cook County, Tom Dart, who's a personal friend of mine, who says without any challenge from any side whatsoever, he runs in the Cook County Jail, the largest mental health institution in the United States. So many of these prisoners are suffering from mental illness. We still have a lot of work to do. When the pandemic began, many of us feared that barring immediate and decisive action, our nation's prisons were headed for catastrophe. March of last year, I joined Senator Grassley, along with 12 of our colleagues, in sending a bipartisan letter to Director Carvajal and the former Attorney General. In it, we urged you to use your authority under the First Step Act to swiftly transfer vulnerable inmates to home confinement. We sent that letter out of concern for the health and well-being of the inmates, as well as 37,000 Americans working in our federal prisons. At the time we sent the letter, only 3 inmates and 3 staff members had tested positive for COVID-19. What happened? In the months that followed, tens of thousands of federal prisoners tested positive for COVID-19. At times, the infection rate for the federal prison population has been nearly 6 times higher than in the community at large. As a result, 230 incarcerated individuals at least have died from COVID-19, nearly all of whom had pre-existing conditions that made them particularly and obviously vulnerable. Several were within months of being released, and 55 died after their request for compassionate release was denied and while their request was pending. One preventable death was noted in this video. Andrea Heiber, 8 months pregnant when the Bureau of Prison officials sent her to the Federal Medical Center in Carswell. She came down with COVID-19 and gave birth to her premature daughter while on a ventilator. Nearly a month later, Ms. Heiber died without ever getting a chance to hold her baby. Thousands of BOP staff members have also contracted COVID-19. At least 4 have passed away, including Rourke Mac MacArthur, a 42-year-old correctional officer at the federal penitentiary in Thompson, Illinois. These were preventable deaths. It's clear that the Bureau has been far too rigid in approving transfers to home confinement and compassionate release to reduce prison populations and to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Unfortunately, this is part of a broader pattern. The Bureau has failed to implement many of the First Step Act's reforms. Let me give you an example. The First Step Act required the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons to develop a risk and needs assessment, but the pattern tool that the agencies created is deeply flawed. The Trump administration itself forecast that the tool would result in stunning racial disparities in inmate security classification. In December, the Independent Review Committee appointed by the Trump Justice Department released a report that found the Bureau of Prisons has failed to develop, and I quote, a fully integrated and comprehensive needs assessment system to diagnose the programming needs of individual inmates, a system the First Step Act requires you to develop. I might add that part of the First Step Act was constructed by Senator Cornyn and Senator Whitehouse on the prison reform side of the equation. The law also mandates the BOP provide all prisoners with opportunities to participate in programming to prepare them to return to their communities. However, many inmates still struggle to access programming to help vocational skills and receive mental health and other services. The simple fact of the matter is, and we know it, the majority of federal prisoners today will be out in society at some point soon in their lives. We have to anticipate it. We want that to be a constructive, positive experience and not create another crime victim. The legislation also requires inmates to participate in programming through earned time credits, but the Bureau of Prisons' proposed rule for earned time credits severely limits the ability to earn these credits, and that undermines participation. The Bureau's failure to implement the First Step Act reform speaks to a broader issue of mismanagement that has impacted everyone in our prison system, from the incarcerated to your own loyal employees. For years, the Bureau of Prisons have been plagued by chronic understaffing. It has been worsened by the previous administration's decision in 2017 to implement a hiring freeze that led to the elimination of more than 6,000 Bureau of Prisons positions. Today, there are still thousands of vacant positions. To compensate for staff shortages, the Bureau has come to rely on widespread and often mandatory overtime, as well as augmentation. Augmentation is a practice that forces non-custodial staff like secretaries, teachers, and librarians to work as correctional officers. The Council of Prison Locals, which represents most BOP employees, notes in testimony for the record today that, quote, the staffing crisis in the Bureau of Prisons not only creates a large, clear, and present danger to every employee, inmate, and the community at large, but has made the response to COVID-19 pandemic nearly impossible. The Americans working in our prison system are overworked, overextended, and undersupported. As a result, incarcerated individuals and the communities to which they return are put at risk. Simply put, our prison system at the federal level is failing. It's failing to fulfill its fundamental purpose, the rehabilitation of incarcerated individuals. As I said, most of the individuals are going to return to society. Instead of preparing them, we are failing them, and failing American people, who want, of course, safety in our communities. Part of that failure includes the excessively punitive and unjust practices to maintain order in our prisons, practices like administrative separation or solitary confinement. Following my hearings in 2012 and 2014, there were significant reductions in the use of solitary confinement. But I am troubled that the number of federal inmates in restricted housing increased significantly over the last 4 years. I'm gravely concerned that during the pandemic, the Bureau has used extensive solitary confinement as a means to enforce social distancing. You just can't separate people 23 hours a day without an impact on their mental health. This oversight hearing is an opportunity to get a clear accounting of what's going wrong in our federal prisons and what we need to do to fix it. We can start by vaccinating our inmates in a timely manner, not only for their protection, but the protection of all the men and women in the federal employment who maintain these prisons. I'm eager to hear about the Bureau's plans. When are we going to implement the First Step Act? How are we going to build the reforms that we passed on a bipartisan basis, signed by President Trump? We can't keep wasting valuable resources and taxpayer dollars to let people languish in prison. More than wasteful, it's inhumane. Too many lives have been lost, too many spirits broken by abuse and mistreatment, too many families torn apart.